Word. Okay, we're good. Sorry about that.
No problem. Typically with any system or any solution, there is an end of life. And so if there is, then you as an analyst might also be involved in the retirement and replacement piece of that activity. I have in the past been involved in that, and it definitely is very different from your typical requirements that you do, because with typical requirements, you're building something, you're changing something that's that will benefit the company overall as a whole. With retirement, you're kind of doing the opposite of that. And so it's quite interesting. All right, so your role. Again, with every company, it's different. I can tell you that the 4 roles that I put on here, I've definitely played or wore one of these hats in one time in my life or another. And those roles are either as a consultant, as oversight, partial hands-on, or full hands-on. So again, depending on your company, your role in UAT is kind of across the spectrum. As a consultant, you would typically just provide guidance to the UAT testers as needed. And really that's all that's expected of you. You're not really doing the testing, you're not doing any of that documentation. Given that you potentially are the one that wrote the requirements, you're there just to give information and give feedback on what it is that they're testing to ensure that they're within the scope of the requirements that you created. For oversight, typically you're accountable for the test activities, you provide direction, you help remove obstacles, and you monitor the test progress of the testers, but you're not doing the testing. You have a team, typically from the business side, that is dedicated, that is doing the testing as part of the project. And then once they're done with their piece, they go back to doing their typical run the business operational responsibilities. But during the time of the project, that is their role. And so your role in that is just oversight and ensuring that they get their testing done. And then there's also partial hands-on. With partial hands-on, that is where you partner with the business to do some of the testing. It could be because there is not enough resources available from a business perspective, and because typically if you're the one writing the requirements, you have experience, and so they can rely on you to complete some of that testing. And so this is, of course, typically driven by the business, and the business is still accountable for completing that testing. And then there's full hands-on. For full hands-on, that is where you are fully accountable for completing UAT, and you are fully responsible for the entire test effort. And that could mean, it's a team of 1 where it's just you, or it could be a huge team of testers that are involved in ensuring that certain pieces of the solution gets tested. All right, so test plan versus test case. We are going to spend a little bit of time on here because based on—
Can I jump in with one question?
Yeah.
Sorry, since before we move to that topic, there's a question: does this process only and always relate to software design, app design, or other kinds of consumer-facing products as well?
In my experience, it's always been related to solutions that require development work, because that solution is a result of requirements that are written by analysts.
Thank you.
Yep. All right, so test plan versus test cases. The bulk of you guys did ask for test planning. And so again, like I said, they both do serve a different purpose. I know sometimes they're used interchangeably, but there is a distinct difference between the two. And the main difference is the audience. Typically with the test plan, the audience is leadership and above. It's really that high level overview of what it is that you intend to do in order to successfully say that you've tested and feel confident about the change that's going in. Whereas with a test case is a lot more detailed, and the audience is typically either other testers that you may have to hand this document to, or it could potentially be your training team that may take a look at it to help build out their training. So for a test plan, typically this is used to communicate, like I said again, to the leadership team. It communicates the strategy of how you're going to test. It includes scope. And so typically you will include in there what it is that you will be testing versus what you won't be testing. A simple one for us here at VSP is, something that could be in scope is, all of in-network claims. And then something that's out of scope could be out-of-network claims. Again, depending on what that change is. It also includes the test environment or environments that you will be leveraging. It's high level. It helps as a guide. I know for myself personally, sometimes when I am in the thick of testing and I have, 10 to 20 test cases, I tend to come back to my test plan to just remind myself of what it is that I'm trying to focus on and what I'm trying to accomplish. So it does really help me to just find my center again. It also identifies risks and if there's any mitigation plans for those risks. And it also identifies the objectives. So what is it, the goals that you're trying to accomplish with the testing? And along with approach, how is it that you're going to do the testing? How are you going to execute that strategy? For test cases, it's again very detailed, and it typically includes step-by-step instructions on what it is that you're going to accomplish. It could be informal, meaning it could just be an email to say, hey, I'm going to test this and these are my steps. Or it could be formal, where you have a template that you guys use, and it has certain fields and certain values or requirements that are needed to be completed within that template. There are preconditions that are typically called out in test cases. And what I mean by preconditions is if in your step you're supposed to validate that a screen is blue, one of your precondition may be one, that you have access to that screen, and two, that you've already landed on that screen. There are expected results, and those expected results are a result of the requirements that were written beforehand. And so with all test cases, there is traceability, and that traceability should always point back to requirements. You shouldn't be testing something that is not called out in the requirements. One, because then it just becomes a waste of time, and your scope just grew as a result of that. And so in order to manage that scope, it's always important to ensure that your testing points back to requirements. And that becomes especially important if you do find issues, because when you do find issues, one of the key things that IT or the developers will ask you is, which requirement were you testing? It also includes data. And so the majority of you guys asked about test data preparation. And again, this is one of those, it depends on how your company accesses data, what type of data you guys house, whether it's a relational database management system, whether you guys use a data warehouse. It just depends on the company. From my experience, especially working at VSP, we use SQL in order to mine our data. And so as an analyst, we have access to a multitude of tables and fields on the back end that we can run queries against to pull test data that matches a scenario that we're particularly testing. so that we can leverage that and put that into our test cases. And so for the VSP folks, especially those that are experienced in testing, they also in their skill set have SQL as something that they know how to use and leverage. And that does really help out because it does make things efficient when you find the exact data that you need, or when you find data that's close enough to it to what you need, so that you can modify it to specifically meet the need that you want for that test scenario. So for test cases, there's also positive testing, and positive testing just basically means that you're testing against the requirements and expecting the output that that requirement called out. For negative testing, this could be something like you are testing and you're intentionally testing for an error message to appear, and so you're intentionally making a mistake in order to pull a result or ensure that the system is behaving in a way where it's producing an error message that would be helpful for you or for the user at the end of the day. And then with test cases, you always have pass or fail. I'm going to pause here. Steve, are there any other questions that I can answer before I move on to the next one?
Nothing in the chat.
Okay, so then what I will do is we can see it in action. I'm going to pull up a Word document. Do you guys see that Word document?
Yep.
So
yep.
I used this last year, and I thought that it was appropriate for me to reuse this year because for some of us here at VSP, we've been kind of using the house analogy for a lot of the work that we're doing as we're building out a specific team. And so I felt that it was still quite appropriate. And what I started with was, as an analyst, you typically have your requirements. And so these are my requirements for a house that I'm building. And with any requirements, you typically have assumptions. And so I have some assumptions here. And again, depending on the company, your requirements may look different. What I did was a kind of a watered down version of a user story. And so you have your acceptance criteria, your given, your when, and your then. I'm not going to go into detail into all of them, but for example, the first one, it says given the windows are installed, when the homeowner wants to open or close a window, then a window can be opened or closed by the homeowner as needed. So that's one requirement, and we expect this requirement to work by the time quote unquote IT is done solutioning for this. So those are my requirements. And then down here, once the requirements are approved and it's been built out and put into a test environment, you would go and take a look at your test plan, or actually document your test plan while the developers are still developing their solution. I typically use this time to build my test plan so that by the time the developers are done developing the solution, I have my test plan ready and my test cases ready to go. And so in parallel with them doing that, this is the test plan that I would build out. And so again, this is just a loose version of what a test plan template would look like. Depending on, again, every company, there are different test plan templates out there. For our instance, I'm just using this as a simple example. And so typically in my test plan, I would have my project team, so folks know who to get in contact with if we encounter any issues. So I have my project owner, my product owner, and myself as the business analyst. And then there's testing responsibilities. And so for this one, the hat that I'm wearing is full ownership. And so I own the entire UAT. And so my responsibility is to plan and execute UAT. And of course, there's reference documents. In this case, if you have requirements, you can link to your requirements here so that you can go back and reference them if needed. In my case, since I'm building a house, my reference documents would be the floor plan and any home specs that I got from the builder. For scope, I am only going to test the home that is being sold to the homeowner. What's not in scope is any other home. It's just the home that's being built. For the assumptions, of course, with any testing, there's always going to be assumptions. And so my assumption in this case is that water is provided to the home, the hot water heater is working, and electricity is provided to the home. For constraints, again, with any testing, there's always constraints. In my experience, some constraints could be that we don't have enough test regions. And so if we don't have enough test regions and there's multiple projects at play and multiple codes being dropped in there, depending on the priority of your project, it might not get the priority or the visibility that it needs in order for you to get done with testing. And so that's always a constant constraint that I have. For this scenario, one of the constraints is that a walkthrough can't be rescheduled. And so if there's a set date to do my UAT, that is the date that I am given, that is the window that I'm given, and there's no compromise. And so if you miss that window, then you risk going into production with potential issues. There's typically a risk section called out in the test plan. And so in my case, I called out weather conditions because that's just something that's out of my control, home availability, and resource availability. And resource availability is definitely something, again, that is typical with testing. Sometimes the developer might not be available, again, depending on the priority of your project. Or if there are business resources that you rely on. Typically, testing isn't their main role, and so then you have to work with their typical job duties as well, and navigating through that in order to get time on their calendar to do the testing that they need to do. Test environment and tools. And so for my example, I said the home location. Typically for testing, this could be if you have test environment 1, 2, 3, you might want to call it out here. If you have some web applications that you guys use in order to help with testing, you might want to call it out here as well. And then the test strategy. And so I just called out that I wanted to arrive at least 15 minutes early to ensure there's ample time to complete the walkthrough. I want to test based on the acceptance criteria, aka requirements. Prioritize testing to ensure critical requirements are tested first. And then acknowledge that testing was completed and done and is published. I want to go back to the third bullet. Prioritizing testing is definitely critical. Whenever I create my test plan, I typically have a matrix of all of the scenarios that I'm going to be testing. And depending on the requirement, depending on the business need, I will go and rank which ones are higher priority and focus on those first. Because what you learn is sometimes you have a small testing window. And although ideally you want to test everything that you called out, within your testing scope, sometimes that might not happen, especially if there are issues that are encountered and things like that. And so if you can get to the critical ones first, then you have at least some level of confidence with going into production with the change. The last 3 bullets I highlighted because it's important to call out that for some companies, there may be test automation. And so if there is test automation, you can definitely leverage that for UAT. This is very rare and it just depends on the maturity of the company, but it's also good to call out. And then with regards to test data, like I mentioned before, it's really important that you prepare and configure your test data in advance. And so while you're documenting your test plan, at the same time, you should be thinking about what type of test data that you need and what it is that you need to do in order to get that test data. And not only that, but to reserve that test data so that it doesn't get touched by other folks or manipulated in a way where it then becomes useless data for your testing. And that has happened to me in the past where my data wasn't reserved and a developer went in and touched it. And so then I had to redo all my work and pull new data. So it's really important to just reserve that data and then to collaborate and communicate with other individuals in those test environments or with your peers to let them know that you have test data out there and just to not touch it for now. And then typically, like I mentioned before with test cases, if it's done right, it can be shared with trainers to help with training documentation. Because with test cases, when you do your documentation, you typically have screenshots in there, and those screenshots become really useful information, not only to prove that the system is behaving the way you expect it to behave, but to be used for training documentation. So that's a high-level overview of a test plan. This is an example of a test case that I created, and I'm not going to say that there's like one way to do a test case. It depends on the scenarios that you've identified based on the requirements that you were given. Sometimes you might have a project where you only have one test case. Sometimes you might have a project where you have 50 to 100 test cases. I've been in those too. It just depends on the complexity of the project, the requirements, and the solution that was built out. And as you start building out your test plan, you kind of have an idea of how big this test effort is going to be. And so for this example, I just created the one test case. And with this one, I'm just going to test that the light switches are functioning as expected. And so with typical test cases, it's uniquely identified because, like I said, if you have 50 to 100 test cases, you want to be able to say, hey, I found an issue in test case 55. So it's easy for you to look to go and find. You also have an author and a tester. And the reason for that is because sometimes just because you authored a test case doesn't necessarily mean that you're the tester. I've been in teams where we had 5 people testing, and although we authored the test cases, we handed it over to someone else to do the execution or the testing itself. And so it's important to identify the two. And then the test date. The test date is important because as some of you guys are aware, when developers are coding, they are dropping code into different test regions on different days. And so what might be working in a test region on one day might not be working the next day. And so if you encounter issues, knowing that test date is important so that they can go back, the developers can go back and determine root cause to see if there were any changes in that test region. And I always include a kind of a high level overview or objective of what it is that I'm trying to do. And so, like I said, light switches, and just ensuring that it's functioning as expected. And so I'm going to validate that the light switches turn off and on, and I'm going to validate that the dimmer switches can dim. And in this test case, I have this one scenario, well, actually, sorry, 2 scenarios, which I just called out. So the first scenario is the light switches turning off and on. Again, I have my precondition. And so my precondition is that all the lights are turned on. And then these are the step-by-step instructions that I mentioned before. And you would just go and execute this. And so it's pretty self-explanatory that you just go step by step. And again, there's that traceability back to the requirements. And so if you have a step in here that does not trace back to the requirements, you have to question yourself and go and ask yourself, is this really something that you should be documenting or testing? And I mentioned before, screenshots are important. So this is just one scenario. The second scenario I could add is the dimmer switches. And so that would just be another scenario in here. So I'm going to pause there. Are there any other questions, Steve, that came through the chat?
Not through chat, but I think Larry had a question.
Yeah.
Yeah, one area my career has always been emphasized when you're doing a development project is exception testing, because obviously 80-90% of the testing will be normal based on what you're doing and the normal procedures, but there may be 5% exception could be very, very costly if not managed well. That's when I see a flow diagram with even one decision symbol, it it can be a red flag. So I want to know if you want to touch on the context of exception testing with test cases and your test plan.
Yeah, exception testing, and what I called that was negative testing that I mentioned before. That falls under negative testing, and it's really important, like you said, to, even though it's only the 5 or 10% of testing, to validate those, because they were obviously coded for a reason. And sometimes, as any user, sometimes you might inadvertently enter something you shouldn't. And so if that happens, you want to make sure that the system gives you, the right exception response. And so it's important to definitely touch on those as test cases.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
There is another question in the chat. How do you manage re-execution of test cases that are already marked as passed as new builds and defect fixes become available?
So typically, if a test case is passed, I'm assuming that it is because it's been implemented into a release. And so if there are new builds, I'm assuming that that's a new release. And so if you already have a test case that you created that can be reused, I would reuse that one in that case. But I would see that as a whole different set of, it's a whole different effort, because I see that as a new release, a new effort. Does that make sense?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah.
Yep, he says thank you.
Any other questions?
No, but Larry commented in pass-fail, it does not hurt the color code. For example, fail in red,
Yes.
maybe pass in green, makes it easier for one quickly glancing through the results.
I agree. And
yes.
I do that too, Larry. That's the best practice that I do. Okay, if there's nothing else, what I want to do is focus a little bit on issues management, because that was the third item that folks were interested in. And I don't have a deck on that or a slide on that. And so I'll just touch on it. Issues management is definitely important, because as you do testing, you will come across issues. And I am very sensitive in calling them issues, because not everything that you come across during testing is a bug. And so I typically start with the word issues, and then when it gets triaged, that is when we can determine whether or not it is a bug, whether or not it is an enhancement with a potential workaround that we're willing to live with, or maybe it's just the system working as designed and we just weren't aware of it. And so that's why I call it issues management. And with issues management, for me especially, in order to manage the chaos, like I call it, with issues that come in, I typically have a location where I track all of those issues. I track the date that it's been found, what environment it was found in, the requirement that it's tied to, who it's been assigned to, and the resolution. And again, like I said, the resolution could be that it is a bug. And if that's the case, then the developer will typically resolve it and you'll have to retest. Now that's different from a new build or a new release, like someone mentioned before. That's actually within the scope of your testing, and you're just retesting a bug that that you found. In other instances, if it's working as designed, that could be the resolution, and you just categorize it as that. It could be an issue that we are going to acknowledge and assume the risk for, and potentially just develop a workaround for. And it could become an enhancement for a future release. And in that case, I would document that as well. I also enter in comments if it's helpful for anyone that will come after me, so that they are aware of what's transpired with that issue. And then I'll also track the status, if it's closed, if it's still being worked on, things like that. And so that's just, a person of one. If you are in an organization where your testing level is a lot more mature than that, typically you may have a central repository where all issues are logged and categorized by potentially the release or the project that you're working on. And in that case, it's especially with systems that I've seen, developers get notified right away when issues are logged, so that they know when to work it. Or if you have a triaging process, that triage person is notified, and the issue is worked on. And so there's very many different ways of managing issues to a resolution. But those are just some of my experiences and some of the practices that I've put into place. So questions or comments?
I don't see any questions, but I think it's a great idea to have all that logged, because then if somebody else comes along with an issue, they can go in and see, oh, that issue's already been logged, and here was the fix,
Yeah.
so that there's not extra or double work.
Exactly. It provides transparency, and it really does become a knowledge base where you can go back, especially if you've encountered an issue, go back and do research to see if there was something similar that someone else has encountered in the past, and kind of walk through how they resolved it to resolve your own issue. And I see Larry's hand up.
Yeah, I don't know if this goes beyond your topic today or not, but I'm just curious about it. What about developing the test plan cases and the testing in the context of it being a waterfall project, agile project, or hybrid project? Is that something I would think that has to be taken into account when you go about setting up your testing?
I would think so. And, I hate going back to my response, but it also depends on the organization, right? I know with VSP, like I said, although our IT folks have a agile methodology, our testing, even before they were agile, is still pretty much the same. The QA, and I say the QA, like we only have one right now, and Alicia can keep me honest. But the way she documents her testing, it's still in a Word document. She still has test cases, screenshots, pass or fail. That hasn't changed, even though we moved away from waterfall to agile. And that's still the case. And so it just depends on the company and what it is that your leadership team is willing to accept as, a good enough for testing. Any other questions?
No questions.
Okay. Well then, what I wanted to do to wrap up was just to provide a page for you guys with some resources on just the differences between test cases and test plan and what user acceptance testing is all about. And so if it's something that I didn't touch on or I didn't address thoroughly enough, some of these links can provide you with some answers. And of course, you have this great Sacramento Valley chapter. And so if you have any follow-up questions, you definitely can reach out to them and get in contact with me. So with that being said, thank you so much, you guys, for your time.
All right, thank you very much, Mai. I'm gonna we're at the fun wrap up part of our agenda where Steve is going to do